The concept of congressional term limits is one of the most debated topics in American politics. While term limits exist in many state legislatures and local governments, Congress has no such restrictions. Members of the House of Representatives can serve unlimited 2-year terms, and senators can serve unlimited 6-year terms. This lack of limits has allowed some politicians to hold office for decades, raising concerns about entrenched power, stagnation, and a lack of new ideas in government. At the same time, critics of term limits argue that they undermine voter choice and reduce the effectiveness of legislators by cutting short valuable experience. Today, we'll take a closer look at why term limits don't currently exist in Congress, review historical attempts to introduce them, and discuss the pros and cons of implementing such a system. First, let's break down the basics. In the United States, Congress is made up of 2 chambers, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Members of the House serve 2-year terms, while senators serve 6-year terms. But here's the kicker. There are no term limits to how many terms a representative or senator can run for re-election. In theory, a politician could hold office for decades, and many actually do. The average tenure of a U.S. representative is 8.9 years, and the average tenure of a U.S. senator is 11 years. In fact, some politicians have been in Congress for over 40 years. For example, John Dingell, a representative from Michigan, served for a record 59 years. While his longevity can bring experience, it also raises concerns about entrenched power and lack of fresh perspectives. So has anyone tried to change this? Absolutely. Over the years, various efforts to impose term limits have surfaced. One notable attempt was in the 1990s when the term limits movements gained traction. Proposals were introduced to cap the number of terms a representative could serve to 6 and a senator to 2. However, these proposals faced strong resistance in Congress. In 1995, the debate over term limits reached the Supreme Court in the case U.S. Term Limits Incorporated versus Thornton. The court ruled that states cannot impose term limits on their federal representatives. The majority opinion stated that such limits would require a constitutional amendment. 75% of Americans support term limits for Congress. Despite this ruling, public support for term limits remains high. Polls consistently show that Americans believe term limits could reduce corruption and increase accountability, yet the lack of political will within Congress has kept this idea in limbo. So let's break this down. Why do so many Americans support term limits? Pros: first, term limits prevent career politicians from holding on to power indefinitely, and this can encourage fresh ideas and new leadership. Second, they are seen as a way to reduce influence on special interest groups. If politicians know that their time is limited, they may prioritize public service over fundraising. And third, term limits could increase opportunities for younger, more diverse candidates to run for office. But not everyone agrees. Opponents argue that term limits come with their own set of challenges. For one, term limits could lead to a loss of institutional knowledge, where long-serving members often have the expertise to navigate complex legislative processes. Second, critics claim term limits could shift power to unelected individuals, such as staffers or lobbyists, who stay in Washington even as elected officials rotate out. And finally, they argue that voters already have the power to remove politicians they don't like through regular elections. If term limits are so popular, how could they actually be implemented? There are 2 main paths for this. Number 1, a constitutional amendment. This would require a 2/3 majority vote in both the House and Senate, followed by ratification from 3/4 of the states. It's a daunting task, but not impossible. Number 2, grassroots movements and pressure. Citizens can push for change by supporting candidates who advocate for term limits or by pressuring their representatives to sponsor term limit legislation. Interestingly, term limits already exist at the state level in 15 states for legislatures and in many local governments. These examples provide a glimpse on how term limits might work at the federal level. Ultimately, the debate over congressional term limits boils down to a question of balance. How do we ensure experienced leadership while fostering accountability and fresh perspectives? Whether or not term limits are the answer, it's clear that many Americans feel a growing frustration with the status quo. So what do you think? Should Congress have term limits? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into topics that shape our world. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.